we're going to have our next paper presented by Asaf Manela from Washington University in St. Louis. So the title of the paper is Does Finance Benefit Society? A Language Embedding Approach. So some questions that I myself and probably all of us are super curious about.
All right. Thanks for having me. It's been a blast so far. And thanks, Alejandro, for reading the paper carefully. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about this paper. This is joint work with a couple of former students of mine. Manish Jha is now at Georgia State, and Hongyi Liu, who I should update, is now at Visa Data Science. And in this paper, we try to measure whether people think that finance benefits society. So I'm kind of curious, just before going in there, like by show of hands, how many of you think that finance on net benefits society?
You have to raise it.
No, thank you. Anybody that thinks that finance on net harms or damages society? Okay, thank you. So we are at the House of Finance, right? So maybe that's not surprising, but a lot of people out there disagree, and I think this is very important. So Luigi convinced me of this in his presidential address a few years back, and I think Luigi's main point is, even if we as academics really believe that finance benefits society, we should at least care about this question, because the positive role that we believe finance has to play depends on public perceptions of this industry. And that's what we're going to try and measure, public perceptions about the financial sector. So the question hasn't been really of interest before the financial crisis of 2008. But since then, we've had some evidence, most of it based on surveys. So survey evidence on this says that trust in bankers fell after the old financial crisis of 2008. It says that public perceptions really differ from those of economists. So your show of hands, I think, confirms that point. And some recent work shows that it actually has some effects on the, outside of it, like low trust in finance can hinder market efficiency in the insurance sector. The thing about this survey evidence is that it's very short, because nobody asked this question before the financial crisis. So we were thinking about, how do we go and survey people that lived 100 years ago, and we couldn't solve that problem. What we did end up doing is look at books. So we're going to use books to answer these two questions. We're going to ask, how does finance sentiment change over time? How does it differ across countries? And we're going to ask, how do such changes relate to financial crisis and to economic growth? It's basically the two questions we're going to try and answer here. So, like I said, books are fantastic in that we think that they allow us to travel through time and across borders, and to measure attitude towards finance. So we're going to measure sentiment toward finance in this annual panel that for 8 large economies, so pretty substantial, important languages. And we can add, so in some of them, like French, we can go to, I don't know, say 1600. But we're going to focus in this analysis on the sample between 1870 and 2009, which Google put out there. We're going to use some computational linguistics approach that I'll describe in much more detail, because that's sort of the heart of the paper. So I'll spend some time talking about the approach, and then show you 3 new facts about sentiment toward finance that we learned from this new panel. So this is what our panel looks like. You can see the 8 languages that we study. I hope it's not too small. So this is US English, UK English, Spanish, French, Chinese, Italian, German, and Russian. These are the languages that we study. And what immediately jumps at you from this figure is that there are very persistent differences across countries, although there is some time series variation that is substantial, especially when you measure growth. The facts that we document about it is, one, that capitalist countries tend to discuss finance in more positive context. I don't think that's very surprising, but it's important and has not been documented. What did surprise us is that finance sentiment declines 1 year before rather than after financial crises. We're kind of excited about that fact, and I'll show you that in more detail. And the third fact is that shocks to finance sentiment have fairly long-lasting effects on economic growth. Okay, so that's where I'm going. Just placing this in the context of the literature, there's been really interesting work on measurement of public attitude towards the financial sector. Most of this, I would say all of this literature, does one of two things. It either looks across countries at a point in time, or it focuses on one country, say north and south of Italy, and compares them, or compares shocks within that country. What we contribute to this literature is a new sentiment toward finance panels that spend centuries in several large economies, and allows us to answer questions that could not be answered before, I think. If you think about the textual analysis and our methodological contribution, some experts in this room have contributed to that literature. I would say most of this literature has used a bag of words or a dictionary-based approach that misses context. This has been alluded to in several of the presentations over the last couple of days. We're going to build on this Kozlowski, Teddy, and Evans paper, which shows that embeddings, and I'll describe what embeddings are in more detail, but this approach to textual analysis can capture cultural associations and how they evolve over time. How we can improve. So we provide some methodological improvements over their approach by using a model that was designed. So BERT was designed to capture context of text, and we also provide some ways of economizing on computational cost by using this pre-trained model and learning using it over our entire sample. So this is a bit of inside baseball, but it turns out to be an important methodological improvement. Okay, this one doesn't want to be shown. All right, so our data comes from the Google Books corpus. So if you're not familiar with this, what Google did a few years back is they built what I imagine is this big vacuum cleaner and kind of went with it to libraries like the Library of Congress and scanned everything wholesale and digitized it. So if you go on the Google Ngrams website, you can go and look at Ngrams and how they change over time. They put out something close to the raw data on their website, which lets you see, say, the number of times a particular phrase appears in a particular language in a particular year. Okay, so up to a 5-word sequence of words. Okay, we're going to use that data as our sentences, and then and we have this data for 8 languages that are shown here. They also have Hebrew there. It's my native tongue. I was really hoping to use Hebrew there, but it turns out that the word for finance in Hebrew is spelled exactly the same as the word for as Maimon, which is the name of a very famous Jewish philosopher. So that completely kills that analysis. So reluctantly we omit Hebrew, but these are the 8 languages that we use. It gives us about 1 billion sentences that mention finance, which we're going to concentrate on. So you may think about hiring RAs to kind of read all of them and think about the context, but my co-authors are on tenure clock. So we're going to use a more automated procedure. We're going to merge this data with macro data from Jordash, Kolarek, and Taylor, and from Barra and Ursula that I'll describe. So how do we do this? Well, we're going to rely on a language model called BERT. This was developed in 2018, and I've got to tell you all, so some of you think that humans are necessary or much better than machines in understanding text. This was true up until about 2018 when BERT came out. Since 2018, these models can beat the average human. So this is not you guys. But the average human now comprehends text worse than this class of models. So BERT and its offspring have revolutionized textual analysis. And we're going to use BERT to measure whether sentences that mention finance are on average closer to finance damages society versus finance benefits society. So what does BERT do for us? Well, BERT takes a sentence, say, correcting corruption or financial malpractice is a sentence in our corpus, and it embeds it into an 800 or so dimensional vector. Okay, so you give it a sentence, it gives you an 800 dimensional vector of real numbers. That's what it does. These word embeddings, as jargon for that, are helpful because it turns out that they respect some kind of simple vector operations. Like it's been, one of the common examples is if you take the vector for king that comes out of these methods and you subtract the vector for man and add back the vector for woman, you get a vector that's closest to the vector for queen. Okay? This is kind of nice relationships. Measuring distance in this space is a helpful statistic. And what BERT does for us especially is it's particularly good at distinguishing context. So understanding not just a word in isolation, but rather the words that come before it and after it and how that changes that particular word. All right. So what do we do with BERT? So we take 5 sentences that represent what we think is positive sentiment toward finance, and 5 opposite sentences that represent the negative sentiment toward finance. So we pick these sentences. We try to kind of go with Luigi's question, does finance benefit society? So we take these 5 sentence embeddings and these 5 sentence embeddings. These are, again, each one is just an 800 dimensional vector. And we subtract the average of them for one. So we average these, we average those, and we take the difference. Okay? This, for us, defines what I'm going to call the finance sentiment dimension. Okay? This is not the end. Now we take this, we now have an 800 dimensional vector, right? This is the positivity dimension. And now we can take any sentence that you give us, any sentence in the Google Books project, say financial sector supports economic development, and project it on this dimension or on this vector, right? We just take the dot product of the normalized vectors. How is that helpful? Well, the dot product of of these vectors, right? This one with this one, tell us would be 1 if this is a perfectly positive sentence. It would be 0 if those sentences are orthogonal, and it would be -1 if it's very, very negative, actually. Okay, so jargon for this is cosine similarity because the cosine gives you the angle between normalized vector. It gives you this angle which captures it, which is measured exactly by the projection of those normalized vectors. All right, so this is what we're measuring. This gives us a sentiment index between -1 and 1 for every sentence in our corpus. So we're going to apply this to all of the sentences in all of the languages that we study, and we're going to say finance sentiment for language I in year T is the cosine similarity across mentions. Okay, so I hope this kind of makes sense, but that's what we're doing. I'll show you some more examples. So if we do this for English, for example. These are the most positive sentiment sentences that we have there on the left, and these are the most negative sentences that we would get on the right. And I hope you'd agree with me that these are pretty negative about the finance or the place finance in a negative context, and these place it in a pretty positive context. So we repeat this for all the languages in our data set, and then we get this panel that I showed you before. Right, that's what's behind this panel. So this panel is, I should say, we have a lot of data here. So there are 95% confidence intervals around these lines. It's just that except for Chinese, you cannot really see them. They're very, very, very tight. As I mentioned, there's a lot of cross-sectional variation here that trumps the time series variation. I don't know if you can see this from the graph. There's a modest positive time trend. So on average, sentiment toward finance is improving over time. If you are familiar with these languages' history, so you're probably familiar with your own native tongue, which may appear here on this graph. You may notice, for example, that sentiment towards Russian increases permanently around the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. The one that's I would say surprised me kind of the most. I did not expect Chinese sentiment towards finance to be so kind of stuck in the middle between these European Latin languages. My Chinese co-author and and a lot of people that I've presented this paper to are not that surprised by it. They think that there's it's reasonable that there's positive attitude towards financial institutions there. But there's clearly a lot of time series variation. If you look at major events in the history of China, those drops and increases tend to coincide with that. Now, I'd like to get some common concerns out of the way. So I often get asked, well, books don't represent the average citizen, especially when you go far back in time. Maybe people didn't read books or did not have the ability to own books a lot far back in time. I would say absolutely. But I still think that this literary elite, if you will, is very important. It commands a large share of wealth and resources and influence on what other people think. And I think if that's all we're capturing here, I'm kind of happy. Also, Spanish is spoken outside of Spain. Like recently in our sample, probably the most important economy that speaks Spanish is Mexico and not Spain. This is absolutely true. So we were making a leap of faith going from language to country. But for most of our sample, this is a clear country or an economic area that's associated with a particular language. This will introduce, though, some measurement error, especially toward the end of our sample. Languages also may have changed over time. This is absolutely true. I've worried about this a lot for a previous paper of mine. So what we assume in this paper is that the meaning of language, so the meaning of bad and the meaning of bank, say, stays the same over time. What changes is the word use. So the frequency at which people use those two words together, bad bank, as opposed to good bank, that changes over time. And that's where our estimates are coming from those changes in phrase use. You may also say, well, finance is a kind of a broad concept. There's more specifics there. And I'm sympathetic to that. We tried to aim at Luigi's question, does finance benefit society? And you all had to interpret that in a particular way when I asked that question in the beginning. But you can also think about narrower concepts, like what about just banks or stock markets or mutual funds or large corporations? It turns out when you look at those more narrower concepts, there's some changes in the orderings, but they're, for banking, it's kind of the same, except the Chinese don't really like banks, but they like stock markets. I don't know why, but anyway, so you can drill deeper into finer notions of the financial sector if you wanted to. Something that we also get asked a lot is maybe some languages just more positive than others. This is certainly so. It turns out that Russian, I don't know why, but it's kind of negative about many other things than just finance. So we try to look at other industries that have existed for a long period of time. So we looked at coal, paper, and tobacco industries and tried similar things. You don't get the same orderings, except that, I don't know, Russian kind of always at the bottom. I'm not sure why. We also tried this exercise with just a word we thought was kind of neutral. Anyway, these don't trend in the same way that finance trend. Ordering is kind of different. So what do we do with this? We first show that finance sentiment is positively associated with attitudes towards capitalism. Okay, so those countries at those points in time that have a more favorable sentiment toward finance, they have a more right-wing or right-leaning government. They have a preference for private ownership of business as opposed to government ownership of business. And it's easier to register a business in those countries. Okay. Now, if you look carefully at what happens when we include country fixed effects, you'll see that most of this variation is cross-sectional. So most of this is cross-sectional variation. That's just the nature of the survey data that we have on these. It's the bulk of the variation is cross-sectional. So I don't think this is terribly surprising. I think of this more as a validating exercise. I did find this one surprising though. So based on the literature after the financial crisis, what I expected to see was that you have a financial crisis and then sentiment toward finance drops. It's not at all what we see in the data. So what we see in the data is that finance sentiment drops 1 year before financial crises. So crisis maybe is a stretch, but this is a period of banking distress as defined by Baron, Werner, and Xiong. So these are periods when bank equity declines by more than 30%. That's how they defined a banking distress period. So sentiment toward finance drops, then you have a financial distress period, and you don't really see much of anything afterwards. Okay, so I don't know if this is surprising to you. This was surprising to me, and I thought worth writing home about. What's also interesting here is that 2 years before, there's sort of a boom in sentiment towards finance. This is kind of reminiscent of the literature on credit booms going bust, if you're familiar with that, the Scholarik and Taylor stuff. So they documented that financial crises come after credit booms, so periods when credit growth is really, really high, about 2 years before. So it's kind of consistent with that. So we thought we would kind of horse race the two. So what I'm showing you here are regressions like in the Scholarik and Taylor paper, where we're not just including credit growth, but we're also including finance sentiment growth. Okay, so this is sort of our benchmark, our baseline result, just finance sentiment. You can see that a drop in finance sentiment today predicts these bank equity declines next year. That's roughly what I just showed you. You can include the first lag there, I guess second lag there, and that result is still there. But what happens when you include credit growth, the Scholarik and Taylor result? Well, this is the Scholarik and Taylor result. This is roughly what you'd expect from their paper, but this result survives. If anything, it's a bit strengthened by controlling for credit growth. So you can also do this with linear probability models. These are logistic regressions. This is a linear probability models. You can include year fixed effects, country fixed effects, and this result is still there. I should mention, you have a smaller data set here because we don't have credit growth for Russia or for China, so we have to sacrifice them to answer this question. So before the old financial crisis, many economists thought of finance as a veil. If you think about finance as a veil, probably not anybody in this room, then it really doesn't matter whether people think the veil is kind of red or white, right? Who cares? So to answer this question, we try and estimate impulse responses to a shock to finance sentiment growth. So suppose you have a shock to finance sentiment growth, and you're controlling for lags of GDP growth, credit growth, these other reasonable candidates for affecting growth, to try and get that causality. So, this is causality in a VAR sense. So I don't want to, overclaim here, but this is what a microeconomist is going to try and do, and this is what we get from that exercise. So we find that a shock to finance sentiment. So finance sentiment increases today. We see GDP growth increasing over the next 5 years. Okay, so finance is good, right? People believe finance is better, and GDP increases subsequently. Finance sentiment itself oscillates. So finance sentiment increases today, it's going to decrease next year, then increase a little bit after that. It's a very interesting pattern. Now, you may say, well, a lot of the reason why finance sentiment affects growth is because it affects credit growth. Right? People believe that finance is better, they demand more financial services, and that's really what increases growth. We believe that it's probably working through that channel to some extent. So if we include credit growth in these VARs, we still get a positive effect on GDP, it's about half the size of what we get if we don't control for credit growth. But so there's still something out there. I guess that's all I wanted to say. All right, so in conclusion, we show in this paper that books can help us travel through time and across borders and to document some new facts about sentiment toward the financial sector. We find that more capitalist countries mention finance in a more positive context. Again, to me this is surprising, but we find that finance sentiment declines 1 year before rather than after financial crises. And we find long-lasting effects on economic and financial growth. Now, if you've thought about textual analysis, and I know a lot of people in the audience have, I would say I think word embeddings are still fairly underutilized in economics and finance, but there's a lot of promise there. So if you have not considered them yet, maybe it's time to reconsider. All right, thank you for your attention.
Well, thanks, Asaf. It's very educational. We're going to have our discussant, Alejandro Lopez-Lira from University of Florida.
Yes. Well, thanks for inviting me again to discuss the paper. Originally, I was just scheduled for the discussion, and then Jules had to cancel. That's why I was also presenting. Perfect. Thank you very much. I find this to be a very interesting paper, very important questions. I actually wasn't familiar with the database also of Google Books, so I found that interesting, especially for long-term things. So my comments may be a little bit more technical, like in some issues that, I just want to see some robustness things, like something that I imagine the referees would ask when you submit. So let me just do a quick summary. Asaf did a wonderful presentation, but just to recap. So we're going to measure sentiment towards finance using hundreds of years of book, right? And 8 languages: American English, British English, Chinese, French, German, Italian, Russian, and Spanish, because those have the best data availability, large time series variation, large level difference between language. There's finance sentiment declines 1 year before financial crisis, no effect afterwards, which I found a little bit odd. And then apparently positive shocks finance lead to greater output and credit growth. And I think overall it's a very cool paper. Sorry. Okay, so just before going to the method of what they do, what would be the traditional approach? Like normally the way you would measure sentiment is you would count the number of good words or sentences with good sentiment versus the number of sentences with bad sentiment, and then just take the average of those and divide, and you would have your measure of that, right? So the advantage of the dictionary approach, which is called, where you just define we have a set of bad words like bad, crisis, etc., and we have a set of good words like growth, surplus, etc., and just count the times that they appear in each sentence. Is that, well, they're extremely simple. We like to think that there are good dictionaries in finance proxying for good versus bad. There's many papers dealing with this. The disadvantage, which is something that this paper is trying to address, is the context is completely lost. So those are just very rough methods, and I was just coming up with an example. So if you say a sentence that there is not way finance is not good for the poor, the sentiment count will not give you anything meaningful at all. It will get completely lost. Whereas BERT has a little bit better advantage in terms of this, because the way it's constructed is you'd basically try to predict the next sentence. So I fit it sentences, or I fit it context, and then BERT will try to predict what's the missing sentence, right? That kind of gives a vector representation that allows to understand context a little bit better. So in that sense, it's very nice. It's automatic. So for example, how does BERT work? You would fix one sentence like financial services benefit society, which is one of the examples of the very unambiguously positive sentences, right? And then you would project it into a 768 dimensional vector space, and this vector space has very nice properties, right? Because it's built to both capture context, meaning, and order, right? And they give the very nice example in the paper where, two sentences which under the previous approach would have the same representation. So in a crisis, we could bank on financing from the government. Is very different from government's financing for the bank is in crisis. But with the old methods, you could not distinguish between those two. Whereas in the BERT space representation, they're going to have like almost opposite angle between each other. Finally, BERT is open source, so you can just download it and start playing with it. There's other models like GPT-2, GPT-3. Those are usually harder to get your hands with. But BERT was a revolution, and it's available. And if you just want to do something, you would just project. I have 2 slides that are not relevant because I just got something, so I'm going to skip those. Not this one. Yeah? OK. So how is this approach? Well, you end up with a vector representation of each sentence, right? And then you're just going to compare against positive versus negative dimension, right? And if it's very, very positive, the angle with positive will be 1. And if it's very negative, the angle with negative will be -1, or would be 1 with negative, right? It's very, very simple. It's just called a cosine similarity in a 768-dimension vector space. So you literally take the dot product and normalize by the norm of those things, right? It sounds perfectly reasonable, and the logic is that if the vectors are pointing in the same direction, they roughly have the same meaning. But because it's a 768 vector dimension space, you roughly have to scale them. But everything is completely sensible, it's completely standard. Yeah, and the classic example is that I like to phrase it a little bit different, is that the distance between king and man is roughly the same distance between queen and woman, right? And of course, you can always do the vector algebra and sum the vector here, and then you end up with analogy. So those are the kind of things that were actually available even before BERT, but BERT is just adding like a superpower things to this effect. OK, so the data, we have 5-word sentences containing the sum of the word finance across 8 languages between 1870 and 2009. Google Book Ngram corpus, it's very nice. I may try to use it for something else. One question, which is what everyone's going to ask, is how does this compare against newspaper? And I totally buy that, this is the literature class, but you're going to say well, yeah, but the New York Times is also heavily biased in that regard. And I'm imagining the sentiment would be different. At least during the financial crisis, probably the New York Times was just trashing the finance industry, whereas most of the books were something nice. So I don't want to give you a lot of homework, but it would be great to compare the sentiment measure across this data set at least. I think the New York Times is easy to get. I understand this is much. If not, at least it would be very nice to make heavily convincing job of why is this better than using newspapers. I understand data availability is going to be great for other languages especially. So you could probably not do this in Russian maybe. I don't know if there's a newspaper available in Russian with historical data set, but at least for English, it would be nice to compare. The sentiment of time is a perfectly sensible measure. It's just the average, the weighted average of the sentiment of each words. The only thing that came to my mind was that this is not taking into account the number of times the books are speaking about finance. So maybe what you could have is that sentiment is roughly the same, but then after the financial crisis, there's a huge spike in the number of times, just the absolute number of books that are speaking about finance, and that could give you some indication or something. It should be easy to control for. You have everything for that. That's fine. Yep. We observe large differences in level in languages towards finance, and that's the part where I was a little bit. I need to be more convinced because the level is hard to interpret. Because remember, we're all projecting these sentences into the vector space, right? And there is no reason to believe that the rotations are going to be equivalent in different language. So just the representation for good in Chinese would be different than the representation of good for English. And maybe not just up to rotation, but maybe the difference between good and bad would be different in Chinese than the difference between good and bad in Russian. So that's that was that part. I don't know if it's worth to do the comparison across countries because the paper is already so nice with that. So I don't know if it's worth playing with these level things. in practice, it doesn't matter that much when you do like growth or when you do differences because you're, the level cancels out. But I'm not sure how much the difference are just because the language have different structure and the vector space representation of that language has a different structure versus the actual sentiment towards it. And for example, so this is something where comparing against like just common measure of sentiment would also give you an idea if there's something going on. So I interpret this in a different way. Like maybe there are just like fundamental differences in the way the vector space is represented, and good minus bad has not the same vector representation in one language versus the other. So it's hard to compare, and I don't know if it's worth like picking up that fight. Finance sentiment growth. Sentiment is already stationary and has meaningful units, so why not just take the difference? I know it's not 0, but it could be 0, so why divide by a number that's 0? At least this takes care of the level issue, so I don't think it's a big deal. You do the robustness checks of doing what happens if you actually use a dictionary-based approach, and we see that there's so much more volatility, right? And the question that I was wondering is like, why is this a worse measure of sentiment, right? I completely agree with you, and I'm on Team BERT, so I think everyone should be using it. But it would be very nice to show why is BERT objectively better in this task than just the standard sentiment dictionaries. And if you have a referee that's one of the sentiment guys with the dictionary, it's going to be extremely hard. The level issue still arises. But anyways, so there's many alternative approaches. So the dictionary, the FastX, Love, Word2Vec, BERT. Why is this a better or worse measure? Like, what's the objective ordering of this, right? What if sentiment is really volatile and we want to pick up the volatility instead of the stationarity? So I don't have the full details, but if you could somehow like design a supervised test, like say like this is just better because we're better at capturing sentiment, like in these kind of sentences, and this other method fails or something like that, it would be great, because otherwise we just have like different estimates. And I understand that from first principles, BERT is better, but other people may not be convinced as good. So if there was some way that you could translate this into trying to predict something and showing that your measure is better, or trying to link this to objectively and showing that the other measure sucks at capturing GDP growth or whatever, that would be very nice. Another small issue is that, as far as I understood, finance sentiment growth could just be picking overall sentiment growth. I don't know if you were controlling for that in the regressions, then nothing applies. But if not, we could just observe the big pattern that right 1 year before the financial crisis, just overall sentiment crashes, right? Like that could be one explanation, and then things kind of like recover or something like that. So at least I would like to see some controls for overall change in sentiment. I know it's not trivially easy to do with the Google books, but maybe some other time series that's out there will give you something. So just trying to control for the overall non-finance sentiment growth would be nice. But this is a really cool paper. It has like an ambitious project. It's nice data sets, cool techniques. It's mostly missing an objective measure of why BERT is better. I know it holds in theory, but it will be great if you can convince with some kind of test, and I'm sure BERT will be better. I would say cross-language comparisons seem hard and not necessary to defend, because I don't think there's anything, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know if there's anything special about the level that's mostly a fixed effect. Yeah, that's all. This is already fine. But overall, it was great.
Thanks so much, Alejandro. Do we have any questions for the presenter? Sure. So, do you want to try first? Yes. Sure.
Super interesting paper. I wanted to give sort of one comment and one question. So first, in validating at least some cross-country comparisons, Russian literature is absolutely depressing. there is not a single happy character there, and as a person who grew up and had to read and learn a lot of it, I can guarantee, to the point that there is a giant epic poem called Who's Happy in Russian, where they try to go over the whole country and ask people like, Tsar and everybody else, and every single person is miserable except for one alcoholic in the pub.
What is this called?
Who's Happy in Russia? Yeah, yes. So I have absolutely sort of trust in the results that we're showing. But as a question, I had the following. So a lot of the sentiment that we see is going to be also obviously a little bit contaminated with the attitude towards other things. So, for example, there could also be an attitude towards economy. It was already alluded by Alejandro. There could be attitude towards, unemployment. It could be attitude towards, technological changes or many other things. And when it comes to the literature, at least in some countries, it's also attitude towards anti-Semitism. So, if you look at a lot of the literature in the 19th century and early 20th century, association with finance was quite often fairly specific, at least for some writers that at least, I'm very well familiar with, well, Russian included. So if you really want to isolate the impact of attitude towards finance, I think one of the challenges is really trying to disentangle all of those things, including general, trends in the language that time specific as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I agree. So there's a good paper by the Kunto, Weber, and I forget at Restad that looks at this within Germany, right? So they look in Germany, different countries, and they show this is a very persistent distrust in finance in areas that are more anti-Semitic. I would need to think about how we can address this in our sample, but it's a good point. Yeah.
Related actually to this historical view perspective, right? So in Italy, for example, after the medieval, there was this development of these big four cities where trading, the start of the development, the Renaissance, right? And the development of the economy was going along with the development of the financial system somehow, right? So the idea here is that any way in which you can find a continuous measure of financial development for those countries and somehow link it to the attitude towards finances, the relationship.
So I think we try to do this. So these are our VARs are kind of about that, right? So we're looking at credit growth within these different countries, and separately from GDP growth. So in those VRs, you have finance sentiment, you have GDP growth, and you have credit growth. So I think, if I understood you correctly, that the credit growth is capturing for us, in equilibrium, how much credit is being used, and we're controlling for that. We still see that finance sentiment affects GDP. Does that get into what?
Yeah, that could be one way. Another way would be the number of, let's say, financial institutions or credit, something like that. Right? To see actually the distribution of the system.
Yeah. So we're kind of limited by data availability there, but if you have a great data source for that spends this century in countries, we'd be happy to use it. Yeah. Oh, I should not. Yeah.
I'd love to see how the attitudes to the financial system correlate with individuals' own willingness to take out debt, because I think again, this is anecdotal, but I'm a German and UK citizen, and the two cultures are opposites in terms of what people think about debt. Germans hate debt, and it's completely normal in Britain, right? And so you could easily do that by just using a different reference vector, which is about, it's a good idea to borrow, or it's immoral to be in debt, or something like that. My other comment was, the stereotype of a novelist is a guy who's been working on his book for 20 years and still hasn't finished it, right? So there's a natural lag in your data.
Absolutely.
So maybe the fact that positive, for example, in the financial crisis chart, positive books come out the year of the crisis, but maybe they started writing them 3-4 years before, and this can also explain some of the smoothing. The reason you don't have so much volatility is maybe because these lags smooth stuff out over time.
So we have thought about this particular question about lags in publication. I guess the quick answer is the Google Books, just the name Books, is a bit misleading because they scanned everything in a library, which includes these serial publications. And they have government reports, academic journals. They have everything there except newspapers. But the more, I would say, empirically answering this question, we have a follow-up paper where we looked at natural disasters and how they shape sentiment toward finance. So for natural disasters, it's very easy to measure the publication lag. Like you have a Hurricane Katrina, I can measure how long does it take until Hurricane Katrina appears in the Google Books project. And it's either within the same year or 1 year later. That's roughly the lag, which, so it's not that as extreme as you thinking about things like financial crisis. But if you think about that result that we had, that I still think is surprising, that the finance sentiment drops before the crisis. If you add a lag to that, that's going to push it even further and be, I think, even more surprising, right? So that's what we think about those lags. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting paper. Maybe one way you can address many other things that arise is, for example, we think of financial innovation as helping give more credit, securitization, for example, that led to growth in credit across automobiles to mortgages to a number of things. Maybe almost use it as a shock because that came to different countries in different time periods. Then you can look at what's the impact on the sentiment afterwards, almost like a different kind of thing. Again, financial innovation, for example, one example is securitization.
Yeah.
Right, and it will be in your sample period, and there's other examples like that one.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Like you would expect people to say, oh, securitization is the greatest thing ever, let's all borrow, and then they get disillusioned.
Securitization leads to more growth in credit, more cheaper automobile loans, and cheaper mortgages, and a number of other things that might lead to, again, increase in sentiment. But in some other countries that hasn't happened. So you can do like almost a difference in different kind of regression that would address some of the questions, right?
It's interesting.
And going back to like Alejandro, you can add it down to like fine-tuning tasks, but probably it's not required to that after birth. But again, we can discuss that later.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I did want to mention the newspaper stuff. So I've done more work on newspapers. I only have them for English. I don't know if you can get the other languages newspapers, but we did. So we had a follow. I mentioned this follow-up paper on natural disasters, and so that one went in a special issue about COVID, and we wanted to study, how sentiment changes around COVID, and you cannot do that with the books because it's just like, if you look at, across a year, it didn't happen. So in terms of financial markets, not, health-wise, but then we looked at newspaper data that we could get for that period, and then you can see these interesting patterns and how that moves around March of 2020. So I'm very sympathetic to newspaper data. I just don't have it for the century. Is that it? All right. Thank you.